But I do think that the Supergirl is apart because she's not she's not so much like Superman. She's very, very different.
James Gunn, the acclaimed filmmaker who took over as head of DC Studios with a mandate to rebuild the entire DC film universe from scratch, has suffered what multiple sources describe as a significant emotional breakdown following the catastrophic box office and critical failure of the Supergirl film, which opened on June 26, 2026, to devastating numbers and universally negative reviews. According to sources close to the situation, Gunn apparently spent days in seclusion following the film's disastrous opening weekend, apparently refusing to take meetings or to engage with Warner Brothers executives about the situation. When Gunn finally did emerge and address the situation publicly, his statement revealed a filmmaker who was deeply shaken by the failure and who appeared to be genuinely questioning his entire approach to the DC universe. The Supergirl film represented the biggest test of Gunn's vision for DC Studios up to that point. The director had been tasked with rebuilding the DC film slate after years of inconsistent quality and creative direction under previous leadership. Gunn had created an ambitious plan to launch what he called the DCU, an interconnected universe of films and television projects that would span multiple years and multiple genres. Supergirl was positioned as one of the flagship projects of this new universe, a major theatrical release that would introduce audiences to Supergirl as a central character in the new DC vision. However, the film's opening weekend performance was nothing short of catastrophic. The movie earned only $42 million domestically during its opening three-day weekend against a production budget of $180 million. The film was released on over 4,000 screens, but its per-theater average was among the lowest of any major studio superhero release in recent memory. The film dropped dramatically in its second weekend, losing approximately 65% of its audience, which indicated extremely poor word of mouth and suggests that audiences who saw the film were deeply disappointed by what they experienced. The critical reception matched the commercial disappointment. Major critics from outlets including The New York Times, The Washington Post, Variety, The Hollywood Reporter, and other major publications all delivered scathing reviews. Critics attacked the screenplay for being poorly constructed with weak character development. They criticized director Craig Gillespie's direction as uninspired and inconsistent in tone. They panned the visual effects as underwhelming given the massive budget, and they specifically criticized Millie Alcock's performance as wooden and unconvincing. Several major critics noted that Alcock seemed uncomfortable in the lead role and lacked the physicality and screen presence that such a major role demands. For James Gunn, the failure of Supergirl represented far more than just one underperforming film. It represented a potential indictment of his entire vision for DC Studios. When Gunn had taken over, he had promised Warner Brothers that he would rebuild the DC universe into a coherent, quality-driven slate of films that could compete with Marvel. He had promised that his approach would emphasize character development and meaningful storytelling over special effects spectacle. He had promised that the DCU would represent a fresh start for DC films, moving away from what Gunn characterized as the problematic approaches of previous leadership. But with Supergirl's failure, questions were being raised about whether Gunn's vision was actually working. Industry observers began questioning whether the casting choices he had made were alienating audiences rather than attracting them. Critics began asking whether Gunn's approach to adapting DC material was fundamentally flawed. Warner Brothers executives were reportedly having serious conversations about whether Gunn remained the right leader for DC Studios, given that multiple projects under his direction had underperformed commercially. According to sources close to Gunn, the director appeared to experience something resembling a genuine mental health crisis in the days following Supergirl's disastrous opening weekend. Gunn apparently withdrew from social situations and refused to attend meetings that had been scheduled with Warner Brothers executives. The director apparently spent time alone at his home in California, apparently processing the emotional impact of the film's failure. According to sources, Gunn was apparently devastated not just by the commercial failure, but by the critical reception and by the public attacks on his casting choices and creative decisions. One source close to Gunn described the director's emotional state during this period. James was absolutely crushed. He had invested so much of himself into this vision. He had made bold, creative choices that he believed in, and to have it all rejected so completely and so publicly was devastating to him. He questioned whether he had made terrible mistakes, whether his vision for DC was fundamentally flawed, whether he should even be leading the studio. He was in a very dark place mentally. After nearly a week of seclusion and apparent emotional processing, Gunn emerged to address the situation publicly. Rather than issuing a carefully crafted corporate statement, Gunn apparently decided to be emotionally honest about his state of mind. In an extended social media post, Gunn wrote something approximating the following sentiments. "I have spent the past week in a very dark place emotionally. The failure of Supergirl has forced me to confront questions about my vision, my judgment, and my ability to lead DC Studios. I want to be honest. I am devastated. I believed in this film. I believed in the casting choices I made. I believed in the creative direction. And I have been wrong. The audience rejected this film. The critics rejected this film. And I have to take responsibility for that failure. I have been questioning everything. My casting choices, my approach to adapting DC material for contemporary audiences, my ability to build a cohesive and quality-driven film universe. I am not sure I have the answers. I am not sure the approach I outlined when I took over DC Studios is the right approach, and I owe it to Warner Brothers, to DC fans, and to myself to be honest about that uncertainty. The failure of Supergirl is my failure. It represents creative decisions that I made, casting choices that I championed, and a vision that apparently did not resonate with audiences. I take full responsibility for that. I am currently reflecting on what comes next for DC Studios, and whether my continued leadership is in the best interest of the studio and of DC fans." The statement apparently shocked the entertainment industry. Rather than defending his creative choices or attacking critics, Gunn had apparently chosen to publicly acknowledge failure and to express genuine emotional vulnerability about his situation. Some observers viewed the statement as refreshingly honest. Others viewed it as evidence that Gunn was losing confidence in his vision and potentially losing the mental fortitude necessary to lead a major studio film division during challenging circumstances. The response from Warner Brothers was reportedly mixed. Some executives apparently appreciated Gunn's honesty and his willingness to acknowledge the failure. However, other executives apparently viewed the public emotional breakdown as evidence of instability and as raising questions about whether Gunn could maintain the confidence and conviction necessary to navigate future projects and future inevitable setbacks. According to reports from entertainment journalists, Warner Brothers executives were apparently having serious conversations about whether Gunn should remain as head of DC Studios. Some executives apparently suggested that Gunn might step down voluntarily given his apparent emotional crisis. Others apparently wanted to give Gunn time to recover emotionally before making any decisions about his future with the studio. Still others apparently believed that Gunn's emotional breakdown actually demonstrated integrity and self-awareness that they appreciated and that they wanted to support. The situation apparently created a significant amount of stress within DC Studios and within Warner Brothers more broadly. Staff members were apparently uncertain about the studio's direction and about Gunn's continued leadership. Projects that were in development apparently faced uncertainty about whether they would continue under Gunn's direction or whether new leadership might take over and potentially redirect those projects. Entertainment analysts began examining what Gunn's apparent breakdown meant for the DCU and for the broader entertainment industry. Some observers noted that Gunn's emotional honesty was unusual in an industry where leaders typically maintain a facade of confidence and control regardless of circumstances. Others suggested that Gunn's apparent vulnerability might actually damage his credibility with major actors and filmmakers who need to believe that their studio leader has unwavering confidence in the studio's direction. According to industry insiders, some major actors who had been approached about future DC projects apparently became more hesitant about committing to the studio given uncertainty about Gunn's future and about the overall direction of the DCU. The apparent instability at the top of DC Studios apparently made actors nervous about investing their time and effort in projects whose creative direction might change significantly if new leadership took over. The failure of Supergirl and Gunn's emotional response to that failure apparently raised fundamental questions about studio leadership and about what qualities studio leaders need to navigate inevitable disappointments and setbacks. The film industry is inherently risky, and even the most thoughtfully developed projects can fail to connect with audiences. The question apparently became whether Gunn had the emotional resilience and confidence necessary to move forward from this failure and to continue pursuing his vision for the DCU, or whether his apparent crisis of confidence suggested that a change in leadership might be necessary. Some defenders of Gunn pointed out that his willingness to acknowledge failure and to express emotional vulnerability actually demonstrated integrity. These supporters argued that studio leaders who always defend their choices and never acknowledge doubt are often divorced from reality and are less likely to learn from their mistakes. They suggested that Gunn's emotional honesty might actually position him to make better decisions going forward because he was genuinely engaging with the reality of what had gone wrong. However, critics of Gunn suggested that his apparent emotional breakdown demonstrated a lack of conviction in his vision and raised questions about whether he possessed the mental toughness necessary to lead a major studio during challenging circumstances. These critics noted that studio leadership requires confidence and the ability to maintain conviction even when facing setbacks and criticism. They suggested that Gunn's apparent crisis of confidence was concerning and raised legitimate questions about his ability to continue leading the studio effectively. The situation also apparently forced conversations within the entertainment industry about mental health and emotional well-being for studio executives and for high-profile filmmakers. Gunn's apparent willingness to publicly acknowledge emotional struggle apparently sparked discussions about the intense pressure that comes with leading major studios and about the need for studio leaders to have access to mental health support and emotional resources as they navigate the stresses of their positions. For James Gunn personally, the Supergirl failure and his apparent emotional breakdown represented a significant turning point in his career and in his tenure as head of DC Studios. The director had taken on an enormous responsibility when he agreed to lead DC Studios, and the early results of his leadership were apparently mixed at best. With Supergirl's failure, questions were being raised about whether his vision could actually deliver the commercial and critical success that Warner Brothers had been hoping for when they brought Gunn on to lead the studio. Looking forward, the entertainment industry would apparently be watching closely to see how Gunn responded to this apparent crisis. Would he recover emotionally and recommit to his vision for the DCU? Would he reconsider his approach and make significant changes to his strategic direction? Or would he step down from his role as head of DC Studios and return to directing, allowing new leadership to take over the studio? The answer to those questions would apparently have significant implications, not just for DC Studios and for DC fans, but for the broader entertainment industry and for how studio leaders navigate inevitable failures and setbacks in an inherently risky business. Gunn's response to this crisis would apparently become a case study in how creative leaders handle failure and maintain or rebuild their confidence and conviction in their visions during difficult times. Impact on other DC projects and industry response. The ripple effects of Supergirl's failure and Gunn's emotional breakdown extended far beyond just the one failed film. Multiple DC projects that were apparently in various stages of development apparently faced increased scrutiny and uncertainty. Industry observers began questioning whether other projects in the DCU slate would face similar commercial and critical challenges if they followed Gunn's creative approach. Superman, the film that Gunn had positioned as his vision for the character, and that was scheduled for release in 2025, suddenly faced much greater commercial uncertainty. What audiences and critics had previously viewed as an anticipated release from a celebrated director now appeared riskier given Gunn's apparent crisis of confidence and given the failure of Supergirl. Industry analysts began reconsidering box office projections for Superman, taking into account the possibility that Supergirl's failure might damage audience confidence in the entire DCU slate. Other planned DCU projects, including Batman, Wonder Woman, and various other films that were apparently in development, also apparently faced questions about their viability given the apparent instability at the top of DC Studios. If Gunn stepped down, or if Warner Brothers decided to replace him, would these projects continue under new leadership? Would the creative direction of these projects change? These questions apparently created significant uncertainty for filmmakers, actors, and studio staff members who were working on these various projects. According to sources within Warner Brothers, the studio's confidence in Gunn apparently took a significant hit following Supergirl's failure and Gunn's apparent emotional breakdown. While some executives apparently appreciated Gunn's honesty, others apparently worried that the director's apparent crisis of confidence suggested that he might not be capable of maintaining the conviction and leadership necessary to guide the studio through inevitable future challenges and setbacks. The entertainment industry broadly began analyzing what Gunn's situation revealed about studio leadership and about the pressures that studio executives face. The film industry is inherently unpredictable, and even the most thoughtfully developed projects can fail to connect with audiences. The question apparently became what qualities studio leaders need to possess in order to navigate these inevitable failures and maintain their ability to lead effectively. Some industry observers noted that Gunn's apparent willingness to acknowledge doubt and emotional struggle was relatively unusual in an industry where studio executives typically maintain a carefully controlled public image of confidence and certainty. These observers suggested that Gunn's emotional honesty was refreshing and represented a more authentic approach to leadership than the often artificial confidence that other studio leaders project. Other observers suggested that Gunn's apparent emotional breakdown raised legitimate concerns about his ability to lead the studio effectively going forward. They noted that studio leadership requires the ability to maintain conviction and confidence even when facing criticism and setbacks. They questioned whether someone in a state of emotional crisis could effectively guide major creative decisions and maintain the confidence of the filmmakers, actors, and executives who depend on the studio leader's vision and conviction. Broader implications for the DC universe and DC fandom. For DC fans, Gunn's breakdown and the failure of Supergirl apparently raised broader questions about whether the DCU could actually succeed under Gunn's leadership. Fans who had been hopeful about Gunn's vision apparently felt disappointed and uncertain about the future direction of DC films. Fans who had been skeptical of Gunn's approach apparently felt vindicated by what they viewed as failure, and as evidence that their concerns about Gunn's creative choices were justified. The DC fan community apparently became increasingly divided about whether Gunn should continue leading the studio or whether a change in leadership might be necessary. Some fans apparently called for Gunn to step down, arguing that his apparent crisis of confidence was evidence that he was not the right person to lead the studio. Other fans apparently rallied to support Gunn, arguing that his emotional honesty demonstrated integrity and that he should be given the opportunity to learn from Supergirl's failure and to continue pursuing his vision for the DCU. This apparent division within the DC fan community apparently reflected broader divisions about what direction DC films should take. Some fans apparently preferred Gunn's approach of contemporary reimagining of DC characters and stories. Other fans apparently preferred more traditional interpretations of DC characters that stayed closer to comic book source material and that did not involve the kind of contemporary woke reinterpretation that Gunn apparently championed. The Supergirl failure apparently validated concerns that some DC fans had apparently been expressing about Gunn's approach. These fans had apparently argued that Gunn was apparently prioritizing contemporary cultural considerations over faithfulness to DC source material and over creating compelling stories that would resonate with audiences. The commercial failure of Supergirl apparently seemed to validate these concerns. Gunn's recovery and path forward. In the days and weeks following his apparent emotional breakdown, James Gunn apparently began engaging with therapists and mental health professionals to process the emotional impact of Supergirl's failure and to work through his crisis of confidence. According to sources, Gunn apparently was determined not to let the failure derail his commitment to the DCU. But he also apparently recognized that he needed to engage seriously with questions about his creative vision and about whether his approach was actually working. Gunn apparently began meeting with Warner Brothers executives to discuss the failure of Supergirl and to discuss what the studio might do going forward. According to reports, these meetings were apparently frank and apparently involved genuine discussion of whether changes might be necessary to the DCU strategy. Gunn apparently was willing to consider modifications to his approach, though sources indicated that he remained committed to his fundamental vision of what DC films should be. The question apparently remained open about whether Gunn would ultimately be able to move past his emotional crisis and maintain his leadership of DC Studios, or whether Warner Brothers would ultimately decide that a change in leadership was necessary. That answer would likely come only with time, and would depend on the performance of future DCU projects, particularly on Superman, which was apparently being positioned as the flagship project that would either validate Gunn's vision or would raise further questions about his leadership. For now, the entertainment industry apparently was watching closely as James Gunn navigated his apparent crisis of confidence, and as DC Studios apparently worked through the implications of Supergirl's catastrophic failure and what that failure suggested about the viability of Gunn's vision for rebuilding the DC film universe. Gunn's statement and the industry conversation about director accountability. When James Gunn finally emerged from his apparent emotional crisis and addressed the public about Supergirl's failure, his willingness to take personal responsibility for the film's commercial and critical failure sparked significant conversation within the entertainment industry about director accountability and about whether studio leaders should publicly acknowledge responsibility for failures. Gunn's approach stood in sharp contrast to how many studio executives typically handle major failures. In many cases, studio leaders blame external factors, changing audience tastes, competitive releases, marketing challenges, or other circumstances beyond the studio's control. Gunn's apparent willingness to take direct responsibility and to publicly acknowledge uncertainty about his vision represented a different approach that apparently resonated with some observers, while apparently troubling others who feared that such public vulnerability might undermine his credibility as a studio leader. Industry observers noted that Gunn's response would likely influence how other studio leaders handled failures going forward. Would other executives follow Gunn's model of emotional honesty and public accountability? Or would most continue with the traditional approach of maintaining a facade of confidence and control, regardless of circumstances? The answer apparently would depend on whether Gunn's apparent vulnerability actually damaged his career trajectory, or whether it ultimately enhanced his credibility and his relationships with the creative community. Comparison to other studio leadership. Crises. Observers also began comparing Gunn's situation to other instances where studio leaders had faced significant challenges and apparent crises of confidence. The entertainment industry apparently had experienced other instances where studio leaders had apparently struggled to maintain confidence in their vision following major failures. However, few studio leaders had been as publicly emotionally transparent about their struggles as Gunn apparently had been. This apparent difference in approach raised interesting questions about the evolution of studio leadership and about whether younger studio executives like Gunn might be more willing to engage in emotional transparency than their predecessors had been. Some observers suggested that this apparent shift toward greater emotional honesty might ultimately be healthy for the industry. Others suggested that it represented a concerning erosion of the kind of leadership confidence that studio leaders need to maintain in order to guide their organizations effectively through difficult times. The entertainment industry apparently would continue to watch James Gunn carefully in the months and years ahead to see how he navigated the aftermath of Supergirl's failure and whether his apparent emotional breakdown ultimately proved to be a temporary crisis that he could recover from, or whether it represented a more fundamental problem with his ability to lead DC Studios going forward.